Well, I'm still getting into storytelling because it's a kind of overlooked art form in some way, but it's so deeply profound. So I'm constantly having revelations and learning about it. One of the first things that I did when I was beginning to tell stories, I had a radio show on WBAI on Monday nights, 10:30 to midnight, called The Ocean of Story. And it was the first sort of adult storytelling. And I would sometimes bring storytellers from all over the world who were coming in with the World Music Institute and so forth, and the Asia Society, and have them tell stories and play music. But sometimes it was really hard to find material. So I would then, in between, I would tell stories about my dog and cat. I would tell stories about weird encounters and subways. And I was a roller skating waitress at the Tin Palace bar. So I had lots of interesting things to say. From carrying drinks, roller skating across to Pharaoh Sanders and so forth. And anyway, but then I realized when people were writing to me and they wrote about how much they loved these stories, how much it meant to them to hear about my life. And also that sometimes they would say, well, that story made me understand something about the fairy tale or the myth that you or someone else told. So I began really, it was way at the beginning, exploring this weaving. Later, I found that it was actually something that was done often by epic singers. And like in Persia, the Nakal, the storytellers who would tell elaborate epics and fairy tales, and inside give political stories and other things. And in Africa as well, this was really an old and viable and strong tradition. So it's how it began for me. It gives a lot of meaning for people because we tend to think of these myths and fairy tales as less than real, or you know, old texts from other worlds, forgetting that they were really just edited and that they were quite different once upon a time. But this makes you understand that those are stories that are deeply personal. And then the personal stories, actually, when we weave them, the mythic quality of our lives, it liberates us from kind of small view or falling into feeling that our life has no meaning, is brought forth. Well, I was rushing up to storytelling that I was doing in Harlem for junior high school kids. And I sat down the only seat available to me, which was next to a really elaborately coiffed and dressed homeless woman who had these, sort of earbuds going into her many coats. And somewhere along the line, she started singing, and it was so beautiful that everyone on the subway just stop put down their cell phones, even though they didn't work on the train, and listen to her. And so I tapped her on the shoulder. I said, "Oh my God, that's so beautiful." And then she stopped singing. And I was so upset. I said, "Why did you stop singing?" And she said, "People like you and I, they'll think we're crazy." So I launched into really this old fairy tale about a king who had three daughters, and he wanted them to marry powerful, wealthy men, like merchants and CEOs of corporations. And so the two, elder daughters, they were willing to do it, but the youngest daughter said, "I can't. I've fallen in love with a poet." So the king banished her. And of course, she was quite content to live with the poet in a little hovel. But 3 days later, the king went blind. And the whole story is about what heals him and what is joy, actually. So this is how I just sort of weave in and out. I tell a story about, being in the camps in Haiti after the earthquake and things that happened that were so remarkable that changed how I viewed this world and resourcefulness and inner capacities for joy as an antidote. Well, I think the narrative, of course, is important, but it's not the most extraordinary part. What's really important and totally unique to this art form because of the narrator, and depending on who it is who's telling the story and how they do it, the listener is the co-creator and actually the creator of the story on the spot, imagining, feeling, listening. It's a space between that is alive and visual and associative that opens the natural vastness of the mind. I think it's an irresistible event. I mean, second grader came up to me once after this 45-minute fairy tale that I told in revenge because the principal said, these 250 kids can't pay attention. And they were like in it totally. And afterwards, a girl kept pulling me, my sleeve, saying, Laura, the world needs this. And then, another time I was getting off the stage. It was at Bear Mountain World Music Festival, and I had told stories with these wonderful musicians. And, they were sort of African and Latin American folk tales and so forth. And a woman came up to me and she said, I just had to talk to you. I listened to that story and I decided not to divorce my husband. So I had to really think about what happened in that story and what happened to her that allowed her to hear something that she was not able to hear about her own aggression. And so it was, so in that way, I just think that they are a mirror to aspects of ourselves. But it's the reciprocity, the living dynamism of it. It's not a kind of rehearsed, memorized text. It's a living relational occurrence, or as a great poet of Canada said, Robert Bringhurst, a story is not a solid house, it's an occurrence. And I think that we long for that. I mean, I'm in prisons telling these stories, and I just like, wow, why was that guy so mean? Murderer saying that to me. I said, well, why do you think so? Well, somebody must have been mean to him as a kid. It's all like that. Or going into, a corporation telling a story and everybody listening and then spontaneously telling their own stories about their lives. It's what is really human, but it's not just the content. What's human is this part of our mind that heart mind, that we tend to ignore, that is enlivened and very naturally comes to the fore. We hardly notice that the whole time we have been visualizing the story, and everyone has seen it in their own way, and everyone in that moment is transformed from a stranger to a communal house of guests. Oh, it's been hard work because I keep wanting to get better. I want to be more authentic. I want to know more. But I think, there's levels of things in childhood. I think I escaped a lot into playing. I was a kind of fantast. I had, alongside the wall underneath my bedroom where the sun never shone, I had a little graveyard that I made, and I buried things, and I would create eulogies. And I think that there was a lot of, I had first generation immigrant parents, but my grandmother there, and it was in the face of the Holocaust. And in Brooklyn, where I grew up, there were so many survivors, so many people whose lives had been wrenched, and it was secretive. But I think that you feel those things as a child. You feel the hidden nature of the spirituality of the world. And there's a desire, a compassion in children to mend it. So I think that's part of what happened to me as a child, and it was this love of literature. My brother and I were endlessly concocting crazy stories about our family, actually, at the dinner table, driving my father into lifting up the newspapers more and more so he could somehow escape our what he thought was hysteria, and my brother and I thought was hilariously clever. My brother was a scholar of comparative literature, so I think that. But also, the very first time I told a story, I had dropped out of graduate school. I was in experimental theater in this Gurdjieff theater company, and not Gurdjieff, Butowski. I did go to Gurdjieff groups, I was very interested in something. And it was when I accidentally told a story that suddenly it happened. What happened between myself and the audience was so alive. There was all the timelessness and formlessness that we were looking for in the 60s and 70s, and experimental theater occurred in this form because of its particular sort of invisible architecture.